Good evening. My name is Michelle Jabor, and today's date is 7/4 of 2022. In today's lecture, I'll be talking about the hormonal control of implantation and early embryonic development. To start off this discussion, I like to discuss the parts of the female reproductive system. The first part that we're going to be talking about is going to be the vagina, which is basically a canal that joins the lower parts of the uterus, or what we know as the cervix, to the outside of the body. The vagina is known as well as the birth canal. The second part of the reproductive system that we're going to discuss is the uterus, or the womb. The uterus is a hollow, pear-shaped organ that is placed that is the place where the fetus would develop. The uterus itself is divided into two different parts. The first part is the lower part of the uterus, or the cervix, which opens into the vagina, and the second part is the main body of the uterus, or the corpus. The corpus is the part of the uterus that can expand easily, and this is where the embryo will develop. The cervix has a canal that attached to it, and this canal will allow the sperms to enter and the menstrual blood to leave. The third organ that we're going to be talking about today are the ovaries. These are very small shaped gland. There are very small oval shaped glands that are located on both sides of the uterus. They produce eggs and hormones. The ovaries, just like any other organ, have two different parts of it: the medulla and the cortex. The medulla is also known as the zona vasculosa because it has a lot of blood vessels attached to it. The cortex is the outer part, and this is where the follicular development occurs. Lastly, we have the fallopian tubes, which are very narrow tubes that attach to the upper part of the uterus. This is the pathway where the egg cells can travel from the ovaries to the uterus. The fertilization of an egg takes place in the fallopian tubes as well. The sperm will wait for the egg in the fallopian tube, and then the fertilized egg later on would move down to the uterus where it will implement in the uterine lining. Moving on, I would like to discuss the membrane of the uterus, since this is the most important part of the implantation and the embryonic development. The uterus is has a very thick wall that has three different layers to it. The very inner layer of the lining of the uterus is called the endometrium, and this is made of glandular cell that make secretion. The second part of the uterus, the second layer, is what we call the myometrium, and this is the thickest of all three layers that the uterus does have. The myometrium is mostly made of smooth muscle cells. The outermost part of the uterus is what we call the perimetrium, and the perimetrium, or the serous layer, secretes lubricant fluid to help reduce friction. As well, it consists of superficial layer, or a mesothelium, and a thin layer of connective tissue sits right next to it. The perimetrium also is a part of peritoneum that covers part of the organs in the pelvis. Now that we know what the basic parts of the female reproductive systems are, we're going to go into discussing the fertilization of the egg. So the first part of any embryonic development would be the fertilization of the egg, or a oocyte, which should be fertilized by a sperm. The fertilization happens as soon as the first sperm fuses with the egg. Before any sperm can fertilize the egg, it has to finish its maturation steps, and this will be called the capacitation step, which is the very last step of maturation. This step will help the sperm swim faster to the egg. In this process, the lipids and the protein in the head membrane of the sperm will change, so the sperm can move at a faster speed. Once the sperm goes through the female cervix, this is where they finish their maturation and capacitation takes place. Once ovulation takes place, the egg could be fertilized 24 to 48 hours after. The sperm will bind to the epithelium layer of the fallopian tube. The sperm can remain viable in the epithelium layer between 5 to 6 days after. Once the sperm gets a chemical signals from the ovulated egg, the egg can be fertilized, and the sperm will have to penetrate through 2 different layers of the egg. The outer layer, which is loosely connected granulosa cell, and the protective glycoprotein coats called the zona pellucida. The capacitated sperm will release very powerful enzymes from the area in the head of the sperm that is called the acrosome. And this will be called the acrosomal reaction. The acrosomal reaction will help the sperm go through the 2 layers that are already mentioned. And then the enzyme secreted will dissolve the cell junction as well as the zona pellucida, so the sperm can enter inside to the egg. The fusion of the sperm and of the egg acts like a trigger for a chemical reaction, which is called the cortical reaction, that will help disregard any other sperms that exist on the outside of the egg. The membrane-bound cortical granules in the peripheral cytoplasm of the egg will be releasing their content into the space around the egg and around this membrane. This reaction will change the membrane of the zona pellucida, so no more than 1 sperm can fertilize the egg after this point. The fused section of the sperm and the egg membrane open, and the sperm nucleus would be able at this point to go into the egg cytoplasm. Once that happens, the egg can resume the meiosis, so it can complete its second division. Once the second division is completed, a second polar body, which is ejected, is formed, and the zygocyte is now a full set of genes, genetic material, 23 chromosomes coming from the sperm, and 23 other chromosomes will be coming from the egg. When the zygocyte forms, mitosis begins, and the zygocyte will be able at this point to make its way through to the uterus from the fallopian tube. So at this point, it could be implanted, and implantation can take place. Now we can talk about the steps of the early embryonic development after we know what happens in fertilization. So once the mitosis starts and the zygocyte starts moving down, it can take between 4 to 5 days for the zygote to reach the uterine cavity. The progesterone hormones will be secreted, and that would help the smooth muscle in the fallopian tube to relax so that the zygote can move down the tubes. Once the zygote gets to the uterus, it is called a blastocyte, which is a hollow ball formed of approximately 100 cells. The outer part of that blastocyte will become what is called the chiron, or the extraembryonic membrane. The inner layer, the extraembryonic membrane, which will then enclose the embryo and form the placenta. The inner mass of the blastocyte will become the embryo, and the outer 3 membrane that are known as the amnion, which is responsible for secreting the amniotic fluid, where the developing membrane will float. The allotonus, which becomes the umbilical cord, and this is what acts as a connection between the mother and the son, and the yolk sac, which will disappear later on in the pregnancy. It can take up to 7 days after fertilization for the implantation to happen. Then the blastocyte will release enzymes to help it invade the endometrium of the uterus. The endometrium cell will start to grow around this blastocyte until it's completely invaginated. At this point, the blastocyte will complete its division until it becomes the embryo. Lastly, we can talk about the female hormones that can affect the implantation. The human chronic gonadotropin, or HCG, will be produced by the placenta after implantation. This will help support the function of the corpus luteum, which is temporary structure in the ovaries and very essential in the early pregnancy. This is also the first hormone that is detected in a pregnancy test. It usually peaks around 3 months after pregnancy, and then it starts going down. Progesterone is another hormone that will help establish the placenta by stimulating the growth of blood vessel that supply the uterus, and it will inhibit contraction of the uterus so that it grows as the baby does. As well, it strengthens the pelvic muscle for labor. The third third hormone that we can discuss is the estrogen, which will help the uterus grow and maintain its lining, and it will help the fetal organ to develop. It activates and regulates the production of other hormones, and with progesterone, the estrogen will stimulate the breast growth and milk production. Lastly, we can talk about the human chorionic somatomamotropin, or HCS, which is a peptide hormone that is produced by the placenta as well. It will help alter the mother's glucose and fatty acid metabolism, so it will support the fetal growth. So this was the discussion that covered the hormonal control of implantation and embryon development.